So what if the gasoline that's actually powering your car down the highway right now is, I mean, literally the chemically compressed, liquefied remains of the Garden of Eden?
Right.
Just hold that image in your head for a second, And while you're doing that, what if the Neanderthals, like the people we've always been taught to picture as these grunting cavemen wrapped in animal skins, just barely figuring out how to strike two rocks together? What if they weren't primitive at all?
Yeah, that's the real kicker.
Right. What if they were actually these highly advanced, high-altitude survivors of a literal global apocalypse who only retreated into those caves after the world had physically broken apart?
I mean, it completely shatters the timeline that most of us just take for granted.
Right.
We're so conditioned, to view human history as this very slow, very tidy escalator ride upward.
Yeah, like a straight line.
Exactly. You start with microbes, and then you eventually get primates, then stone tools, then agriculture, and after tens of thousands of years of just grinding it out, you finally get the wheel in a city.
Right, the standard textbook model.
Right. But the framework we're looking at today argues that the escalator is basically an illusion. It argues that we're actually looking at a landscape of survivors wandering through a junkyard of shattered perfection.
And that is exactly what we're unpacking for you in today's deep dive. We're going on a massive continent-spanning exploration of early human history, archaeology, and anthropology.
A huge journey.
Huge. But we're looking at all this data strictly through the lens of a highly provocative framework called the Unified Theory of Geologic History, or UTGH for short, which was developed by an independent researcher named Darrell Waters.
Yeah, and we've got a stack of his core text sitting right in front of us.
We do. We're mostly looking at Earth, a biography of chaos, along with Earth, Two Stories, and the associated study guides. And our mission for this deep dive is to trace early humanity's journey from the literal Garden of Eden all the way down to our current global dispersion using this very specific model.
Now, before we get into the actual mechanics of how UTGH explains the world, we really need to lay down a firm ground rule for this discussion.
Yes, very important.
Because we're dealing with source material that fundamentally bridges religious texts, specifically the Genesis narrative,
Yeah.
and hard physical sciences, like geology, genetics, and anthropology.
Right, and if you're listening to this, you might be coming from a strictly secular, mainstream scientific background, you might be coming from a theological one. And we want to be incredibly clear right out of the gate. We are not here to take sides.
Absolutely not.
We're not endorsing the religious viewpoints of the text, nor are we trying to debunk or defend the mainstream scientific consensus. Our only job today is to impartially step inside this UTGH framework, walk around in it, and examine the architecture of its arguments.
Yeah, we just want to understand its internal logic.
Exactly. We want to look at the physical claims it makes and how it interprets the exact same dirt, the same bones, and the same DNA that mainstream science is looking at.
It's basically an exercise in paradigm exploration, regardless of where you personally land on the origin of humanity. The way this framework marshals geological and biological evidence to construct an entirely alternative history of the Earth, it's mathematically and logically fascinating.
It really forces you to think differently.
It does. It forces you to look at the anomalies in the standard model. The sudden jumps in the archaeological record, the genetic bottlenecks, the ancient megaliths that just completely defy dating, and it offers a cohesive, unified explanation for all of them.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start where the framework says human history actually begins, which is the pre-flood world. And right out of the gate, UTGH throws down the gauntlet by completely rejecting the standard out-of-Africa model for human origins.
It does. And the way it does this is such a perfect example of how UTGH reinterprets existing data.
Right.
So mainstream genetics places the origin of anatomically modern humans in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And the logic there relies entirely on genetic diversity.
Because they find the oldest branches there.
Exactly. When geneticists map out mitochondrial DNA, which is the DNA passed down the maternal line, they find that the deepest, most diverging genetic branches are located in African populations.
Okay.
Now, the standard uniformitarian assumption is that genetic diversity requires vast amounts of time to develop through random mutation. Therefore, wherever you find the deepest diversity, that geographically just has to be the starting line. It's the cradle where the population has sat the longest.
But the UTGH source material looks at those exact same deep diverging genetic branches and basically says, You're reading the map backward.
Yes, exactly backward.
It argues that those populations aren't standing at the starting line. They're standing at the finish line of a very, very desperate escape.
Right, because UTGH posits a global cataclysmic rupture of subterranean oceans, a literal breaking open of the Earth's crust. So it interprets genetic distribution through the lens of a sudden catastrophe, not a slow, leisurely migration over millennia.
So it's an emergency run.
It is. The framework argues that the populations carrying those deepest diverging lineages are found exactly where you would expect to find the people who traveled the absolute maximum geographic distance from the rupture's initiation point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, according to the model, the primary rupture initiated in the northern latitudes and spread outward. So sub-Saharan Africa offered the most terrestrial distance, the most time to run, and the highest elevation to shelter from the advancing inundation.
So in this model, Africa isn't the peaceful cradle where we slowly figured out how to be human. It's the lifeboat.
It's the furthest point of refuge.
Which naturally makes me wonder, and I'm sure you listening are wondering the same thing.
Oh.
If Africa was just the place they ran to, where are they running from? Where does UTGH say the actual cradle of humanity was located?
The framework places Eden, the true cradle, in the Eastern Mediterranean Basin and the Levantine Corridor.
Hold on, the Mediterranean Basin, like literally the bottom of the sea.
I mean, today it is a sea, yes,
Huh.
but UTGH reconstructs the pre-flood geography radically differently. We have to completely erase the current map from our minds.
Okay, erased.
Before the catastrophe, the text described this area as an incredibly productive interior continental lowland. It was a massive, lush, temperate valley sitting right at the convergence of major continent-draining river systems.
So it wasn't underwater at all.
Not at all. Because of the lower elevation and the pre-flood atmospheric conditions, this basin was a hyper-productive greenhouse. It was the most biologically dense, ecologically perfect landscape on the entire pre-flood supercontinent. That basin was Eden.
Okay, so if you have this perfect, sprawling, biologically explosive valley filled with the absolute peak of ancient flora and fauna, and then the Earth's crust literally fractures and subterranean oceans explode upward, what happens to the valley?
Total annihilation.
Just wiped out.
Completely. When the rupture event occurred, the ensuing catastrophic flooding and just the sheer hydraulic violence completely scoured the Mediterranean basin. The water didn't just passively rise, it acted like a planetary-scale pressure washer.
Oh, yeah.
It ripped up the topsoil, the massive forests, the animal life, the human settlements, everything. The garden was utterly destroyed.
And this leads us to that image I mentioned at the very beginning of the show, because matter doesn't just disappear, right? The text claims all of that incredibly dense biological material from the Edenic Basin was caught in the massive eastward currents of the floodwater.
It was transported en masse. We're talking millions of tons of organic material. The entire biological inventory of the pre-flood cradle was swept eastward and eventually settled into these massive geological traps.
Wow.
And then it was rapidly buried under hundreds of meters of sediment just dropping out of the muddy floodwaters. Those sediments eventually lithified into rock, right? Sealing the organic matter deep underground.
And then it gets hot.
Exactly. Over thousands of years, subjected to the immense heat of the Earth's crust and crushing geological pressure that trapped organic matter underwent a massive chemical transformation. It basically cooked.
It cooked into hydrocarbons, meaning the physical location where the biological remnants of Eden were deposited and buried is the modern-day Arabian Peninsula.
That's the claim.
The framework is literally arguing that the petroleum we pump out of the Middle East to run our global economy today is the liquefied, pressurized remains of the Garden of Eden.
It is a direct physical claim of the framework. It takes this profound theological concept and grounds it in brutal industrial geology.
It is such a haunting way to look at a gas pump. But let's zoom in on the people who were actually living in this pre-flood world before the water hit. The UTGH text relies on the early genealogical records to divide humanity into two distinct diverging groups. We have Seth's line and Cain's line, and they apparently had very different real estate strategies.
They really did. Following the historical narrative of the texts, Seth's line, which is the lineage that ultimately leads down to Noah, remained in that warm, uniform, highly productive lowland climate near Eden.
So they stayed in the greenhouse?
Yeah, they were the valley dwellers. They enjoyed the optimal conditions. Cain's line, however, was exiled after the first murder. So they migrated away from the basin, moving eastward into much, much more difficult terrain.
Okay, where did they go?
They settled the Zagros, Caucasus, and Altai mountain corridors.
So we have a major geographic split here. Seth's descendants are living on Easy Street in the lush lowlands, and Cain's descendants are carving out a really tough existence in the rugged, higher altitude mountains.
Right.
And this geographic division sets the stage for a massive biological concept that UTGH introduces to explain human development. They call it the front-loaded genome.
Yes. This is perhaps the most critical biological mechanism in the entire UTGH framework.
Let's break it down.
Sure. Mainstream evolutionary biology operates on the assumption that early hominins had simple genomes that slowly acquired new, advantageous information over millions of years of random mutation. UTGH flips that completely upside down.
So they started out complex.
Extremely complex. It argues that the first humans were created with a genome that was front-loaded with a massive, staggering range of latent, unexpressed genetic potential. And crucially, because it was the beginning of the biological line, that genome had zero mutational damage. It was pristine, perfect information.
And the texts argue they were able to keep it pristine because of the environment. Right, something about the atmosphere.
Yes, the atmospheric canopy. UTGH proposes that the pre-flood Earth was enveloped in a much denser atmosphere. This canopy, or atmospheric shield, provided a highly effective barrier against extraterrestrial ultraviolet radiation and cosmic rays.
Which we don't have today.
Not to that extent, no. In our modern world, UV radiation is one of the primary drivers of genetic mutation. It literally hits our DNA and breaks the bonds, causing replication errors. But without that constant, heavy UV bombardment, the pre-flood humans maintained maximum informational fidelity in their DNA. Their cellular replication was essentially flawless.
Okay, I'm tracking the logic of the dense atmosphere and the pristine DNA. But, if I'm listening to this right now, I have to ask. If all these early humans, both Seth's line in the valley and Cain's line in the mountains, started with the exact same pristine front-loaded genetics, why did they end up looking so incredibly different from each other?
Right.
I mean, how do you get massive morphological changes without thousands of years of evolution?
That is the pivotal question, and the answer lies entirely in how a front-loaded genome interacts with its environment. It's about epigenetic expression, not genetic mutation.
Okay, I was actually thinking about this while reading this study guide, and it made me think of an analogy, like a Swiss Army knife.
Oh, I like that. Go ahead.
Imagine this front-loaded genome is the ultimate, incredibly complex Swiss Army knife. It has 100 different tools folded into it, and every single human is born with this exact same knife in their pocket.
Okay, tracking.
Now, if you are a descendant of Seth, living in a lush, warm, perfectly temperate valley where fruit basically just falls off the trees into your hands and the weather is always 75 degrees, you are only ever going to pull out the little toothpick and maybe the tweezers.
You don't need the heavy gear.
Exactly. You don't need the heavy-duty tools, so they stay folded away inside the knife. But if you are a descendant of Cain and you've been exiled to a freezing, rugged, high-altitude mountain range, you are pulling out the saw, the leather punch, the serrated blade.
You're using everything you have.
Right. You have the exact same tools as the guy in the valley, but the brutality of your environment forces your body to open them up to express them just to survive.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and it perfectly describes the mechanism of epigenetics. The genome is the hardware. The epigenome is the software that tells the hardware what to do based on environmental stress.
So the environment flips the switches.
Exactly. Cain's line, living in those high-altitude corridors, faced extreme environmental pressures that the lowland population simply never experienced. They dealt with cold temperatures, much lower atmospheric pressure, lower oxygen levels, and the vastly different physical demands required to just navigate that rugged terrain.
So their bodies naturally reacted to that. The stress flipped the switches on the Swiss Army knife.
Right. Their front-loaded genomes rapidly expressed dormant traits to survive this environment. It wasn't a slow mutation over millennia, it was an immediate epigenetic adaptation.
How fast are we talking?
Over a very short number of generations. They developed incredibly robust, heavily muscled skeletons with thickened bones just to handle the physical torque of mountain living. They developed significantly larger nasal passages and sinus cavities, which essentially act as internal radiators to warm and humidify the cold mountain air before it could reach and damage their lungs.
Wow. Okay.
And they develop pronounced brow ridges, which biomechanically distribute the stress of the heavy jaw muscles they needed to chew tough, cold weather diets.
Wait a second. Heavy, robust skeletons.
Hmm.
Enormous nasal passages, pronounced brow ridges. You aren't just describing a hypothetical mountain person here.
No, no,
You were describing the exact physical morphology of a Neanderthal.
I am. And this brings us to one of the most radical, paradigm-breaking reinterpretations in the entire UTGH framework.
Let's hear it.
So mainstream anthropology categorizes Homo neanderthalensis, along with the Denisovans in the East, as entirely separate, archaic human species, right?
Yeah, that they died out.
Right. The standard story is that they evolved independently over hundreds of thousands of years from an earlier ancestor, lived their primitive lives, and eventually went extinct, or were just absorbed by us, anatomically modern humans. UTGH looks at the exact same bones and says they were absolutely not a separate species.
They were just Cain's descendants.
They were the pre-flood highland communities. They were fully 100% human. They possessed the exact same front-loaded genome as the lowland populations. The only difference was that their genome was epigenetically expressing a cold climate, high-altitude morphology because of where they lived.
That completely upends the classic caveman stereotype. I mean, if they were just the mountain branch of pre-flood humanity, they weren't primitive brutes dragging clubs around and grunting in the dark.
Far from it. When you strip away the evolutionary assumption that older automatically means more primitive, the archaeological record of these people shows remarkable sophistication.
Really? Like what?
Well, crucially, before the flood, these highland people did not live in limestone caves. In fact, the UTGH framework points at a major geological sequence issue here. The limestone caves we always associate them with didn't even exist yet.
Wait, really? Where were they living them?
Before the catastrophe, the Earth's surface in those regions was dominated by ancient Creighton basement rock. We're talking incredibly hard, dense stones like granite and gneiss.
You can't exactly dig a cave into granite.
No, you can't easily carve a cave into granite with hand tools. So they lived in natural rock shelters, overhangs, and constructed dwellings in the high valleys. And they possessed a very high level of culture.
The outline points to some specific artifacts that back this up, right?
Yes. The UTGH framework aligns with the Genesis text, which actually attributes the invention of advanced metallurgy to Cain's descendant, Tubal-Cain. We find evidence of sophisticated tool-making in these highland regions. They engaged in agriculture, and perhaps most tellingly, they had music. Yes. The text highlights a specific fascinating artifact, a carved bare femur flute found in a site called Divje in Slovenia, which is conventionally dated to Neanderthal occupation.
I've actually seen pictures of this flute. It's not just a bone with a random hole punched in it.
No. It has precisely spaced holes that perfectly align with diatonic musical scales. It's a complex musical instrument designed to play specific, harmonious notes.
That's incredible.
Think about what that implies. You do not wake up one day as a mindless brute, grab a bare bone, and accidentally carve a flute with precise diatonic spacing. You carve it because you possess abstract thought, you understand mathematical intervals in sound, and you belong to a lineage that has been refining musical traditions and passing them down for generations.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. We have this thriving, technologically capable, culturally rich, physically robust population living up in the mountains. And down in the valley, in the Mediterranean basin, we have the lowland population, Seth's line, enjoying the perfect greenhouse climate.
Right. The stage is set.
Then the rupture event happens. The subterranean waters breach the crust. The atmosphere is compromised. What exactly happens to these two distinct groups?
Well, as we discussed, the lowlands are instantly and catastrophically inundated. The hydraulic force is unimaginable. The entire pre-flood civilization in the valleys is utterly obliterated.
It's just gone.
Gone. Seth's descendants, the millions of people living in that basin, are wiped out, with one incredibly specific exception. Noah and his family, who were instructed to construct a vessel specifically designed to survive a massive hydrostatic event.
But the people in the mountains, the Neanderthals and Denisovans, they weren't in the basin.
Precisely. They survived the initial inundation. Now, not all of them, certainly. The geological upheaval would have been devastating globally with earthquakes and volcanism, but significant populations of them survived the first wave of the cataclysm.
And I find this point so fascinating because it strips away any sense of human planning. The caves didn't save them. They didn't have some prophetic warning and build waterproof bunkers in the rock. They survived simply by the dumb geographic luck of already living at a high altitude when the waters rose.
Exactly. They were already above the primary inundation zone of the scoured basins. But surviving the initial floodwaters was only the very first and perhaps the easiest challenge.
Because what came next was worse.
Much worse. The post-flood world was a literal nightmare. The environment collapsed entirely. The rupture of the crust ejected billions of tons of volcanic ash, aerosolized rock, and particulate matter straight into the stratosphere.
Locking out the sun.
Exactly. The sun was blotted out. The temperature plummeted globally, initiating a sudden, vicious, rapid ice age.
So picture this if you're listening. You survived the flood because you live on a mountain. But now, the lush valleys below you are gone, replaced by a churning ocean. The sky is dark gray, choking with ash. The temperature is dropping way below freezing, and the snow starts falling, and it just never stops. You need shelter, desperately. And like we said, you can't carve into the granite.
And this is where UTGH introduces a vital geological sequence that completely explains the whole caveman phenomenon. The floodwaters weren't just pure water, they were heavily loaded with dissolved mineral.
From tearing up the Earth's crust.
Yes, the waters had scoured the pre-flood oceans and the continental crust, dissolving trillions of tons of calcium. As the floodwaters eventually began to recede and pool in the topography of the continents, this calcium-bearing seawater became supersaturated. And as it cooled, the calcium rapidly precipitated out of solution.
It's like salt dropping to the bottom of a glass of salt water if you let it sit long enough.
Exactly like that. It dropped out of the water column in massive quantities, forming enormous thick deposits of chemically fresh limestone across these mountainous regions.
So after the flood, almost overnight in geological terms, they suddenly have a brand new type of rock covering their environment.
Yes, and here's the key detail. Because it was freshly precipitated out of the floodwaters, it was soft.
Oh.
It hadn't fully hardened into the dense rock we see today. It was pliable, easily excavated. So, faced with the horrific freezing conditions of the post-flood ice age, these island survivors looked at these massive new mounds of soft limestone and realized they could dig into them.
They could finally make shelter.
They retreated deep into the rock to escape the lethal cold. They carved out the caves.
That is absolutely mind-blowing. Cave dwelling wasn't their original lifestyle. It wasn't the natural state of early man at all. It was post-apocalyptic survival behavior. They were pre-flood humans who got forced underground by a sudden ice age.
Precisely. The cave habitation associated with Neanderthals in the archaeological record is strictly a post-flood phenomenon. And think about the biological compounding effect here.
Because they were already adapted to the cold.
Right. They were already epigenetically adapted to mountain living.
Right.
Now they are isolated in these dark, freezing, damp limestone caves during the terrible centuries following the flood. Their diet is severely restricted, sunlight is scarce, the environment is harsher than ever.
So the adaptations go into overdrive.
Exactly. Consequently, their cold weather physical traits, the robust bones, the massive sinuses, the heavy brow ridges, became even more profoundly and aggressively expressed in the subsequent generations that were born in those caves.
It's a story of ultimate gritty survival, but it's also deeply tragic. They are just clinging to life in the rocks of a ruined world. But while the Highlanders are hiding in their newly carved limestone bunkers, we have to track the other survivors, the ones who didn't survive by altitude, but by flotation.
Right. The remnant of Seth's line. Noah's family, 8 people in total. Noah, his wife, and their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives.
And according to the historical text, the ark eventually runs aground on the mountains of Ararat in the post-flood world. Now, if you look at this through the lens of modern genetics, this is a mathematically mind-bending scenario. It is the mother of all genetic bottlenecks.
It is an absolute extreme bottleneck. According to this framework, all of anatomically modern post-flood humanity descends entirely from just 3 reproducing couples, the 3 sons and their wives.
8 people stepped off the boat, but only 6 were contributing new combinations of DNA.
Exactly. 6 individuals contributing to the next generation.
And reading through the UTGH analysis of this, it actually offers a really elegant explanation for something in mainstream genetics that always seemed disconnected to me. If you read popular science, you've probably heard of Y-chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve.
Yes, very common concepts.
It's this concept that, mathematically, every human alive today can trace their male lineage back to one single man and their female lineage back to one single woman. But mainstream science says they lived tens of thousands of years apart and maybe didn't even inhabit the same region. It's usually treated as this weird statistical quirk of lineages just dying out over deep time.
That massive gap in the timeline is a known tension point in the standard model. It exists because standard mutation rate calibrations assume a constant uniformitarian past. They assume mutation rates have always ticked along at the exact same slow speed they do today.
But the flood ruins that.
Utterly. UTGH fundamentally rejects those uniform calibrations because a global cataclysm destroys uniformity. Under the UTGH framework, Y chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve are not separated by millennia of statistical lineage extinction. They were literally Noah and his wife.
They were on the exact same boat.
Exactly. The genetic bottleneck wasn't a slow, invisible, statistical winnowing down of populations over 100,000 years. It was a sudden, physical, absolute reduction of the global population to 8 living people. And the 3 reproducing couples, the sons and daughters-in-law, carried forward 3 distinct, highly concentrated subsets of that original front-loaded genomic potential.
But the world they stepped into when they opened the door of that ark was fundamentally broken. We talked about the pre-flood atmosphere earlier, that dense canopy that shielded the Earth from UV radiation. The rupture event destroyed it. It's completely gone.
Yeah.
And this atmospheric downgrade triggers something the text highlights that I find absolutely fascinating and honestly a little terrifying: the longevity curve.
Right. If you read the genealogical records in Genesis, the pre-flood lifespans described are staggering. Adam lived to be 930 years old. Methuselah made it to 969. Noah lived to 950.
Which, let's be honest, if you read that casually with a modern mindset, it sounds like total mythology. It sounds like ancient kings list propaganda where they just inflate the numbers to sound important.
Standard historical analysis almost universally writes it off as symbolic numbering or, a mistranslation of months to years. But UTGH treats the text as literal, empirical biological data.
Because of the graph.
Yes, because of what happens after the flood. When you take the ages of the patriarchs born after the flood and you actually plot them on a graph, you don't see a random, messy scattering of mythological ages. You see a highly specific, mathematically predictable downward arc. It forms an asymptotic decay curve.
Right. I was looking at this graph in the study guide. Noah lives to 950. His son Shem lives to 600. Then a few generations later, a guy named Peleg dies at 239. Abraham makes it to 175. By the time you get down to Moses, it's 120 years, which is basically the hard physiological limit for human beings today. It drops like a stone and then flattens out perfectly.
What's vital to understand here is that this is the exact mathematical shape of a biological dose-response curve.
Like in toxicology.
Exactly. If you subject a biological system to a massive, chronic environmental toxin or stressor, the system's viability will decay in this exact mathematical pattern. It is the physiological record of a species responding to a massive environmental shock.
So what was the shock? The missing atmosphere.
Precisely. The UV shield was gone. For the first time in human history, human skin, eyes, and cellular structures were subjected to the full, unfiltered force of solar and cosmic radiation. Furthermore, the atmospheric pressure was likely reduced, and oxygen ratios were altered by the burial of the massive pre-flood biosphere.
It's a completely new world.
A toxic one, comparatively. This sudden exposure to radiation and altered atmospheric chemistry caused massive systemic oxidative stress.
Okay, let's translate oxidative stress into something you and I can visualize. Imagine your DNA, your cellular instruction manual, is a beautifully constructed, incredibly complex Lego set. In the pre-flood world, it sits behind a thick glass case. It's safe, but post-flood, the glass is shattered. Oxidative stress and UV radiation are basically like a toddler who walks by every single day and randomly kicks the Lego set.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Sometimes it just knocks off a single brick. Your body's repair mechanisms kick in, find the brick, and put it back. But sometimes the toddler kicks it hard and a whole section shatters, and your body puts it back together slightly wrong. Now imagine that toddler kicking the Lego set every single day for a 900-year lifespan. The damage is going to compound massively.
That is exactly what happens at the cellular level. It's called mutational load accumulation.
Yeah.
The germline, which is the genetic information that is passed from parent to the next generation, started taking physical damage.
So the kids inherit the broken Legos.
Yes. In the first generation after the flood, like Shem, the incredibly robust pre-flood genome could still repair a lot of it, which is why he still made it to 600. But the damage compounded rapidly. Every subsequent generation inherited a slightly more degraded, slightly more mutated genome, and then they took their own lifetime of UV hits on top of it.
So if you're listening to this and wondering why we only live to be 80 or 90 years old today, UTGH has a very stark answer. It views aging and our current lifespan not as the triumph of modern medicine slowly pulling us out of a primitive past where we died at 30. It views our lifespan as the settled biological equilibrium of a broken environment.
We aren't at the peak. We are at the floor.
We are living out the biological consequences of a literal atmospheric downgrade.
We stabilized at the modern range after about 60 generations of mutational decay.
Ah.
But those early generations, the ones who stepped off the ark with their still extended lifespans of 400 or 500 years, they had a monumental, almost unfathomable task in front of them. They looked at a scoured, ruined world, and they had to rebuild.
And this is where the archaeological record gets turned on its head again, because they didn't step off the ark as primitive hunter-gatherers, rubbing sticks together to make fire and wondering what a wheel was. They stepped off as the inheritors of a lost world, which UTGH claims solves one of the biggest, most persistent headaches in mainstream archaeology.
You're referring to the sudden emergence of ancient cities, the Uruk problem.
Exactly. I remember sitting in history class, and the timeline we were taught was that civilization was this painfully slow climb. You figure out how to plant wheat. 1,000 years later, you build a mud hut. 2,000 years later, you figure out irrigation. It takes forever.
That's the evolutionary assumption.
But the outline points out that mainstream archaeology actually struggles with the physical evidence, because complex civilizations like Sumer in Mesopotamia, dynastic Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization, and early China, they don't show that slow climb. They all seem to pop up almost simultaneously around 5,000 years ago.
The conventional evolutionary model strongly expects a long, gradual developmental prologue. If a city like Uruk is the pinnacle, you should find thousands of years of intermediate villages spread across the region, slowly figuring out administration, experimenting with primitive writing, trying and failing to build monumental architecture.
But we don't find that.
We don't. These massive civilizations appear almost fully formed in the archaeological dirt. They suddenly arrive with complex legal codes, standing armies, advanced astronomy, sophisticated mathematics, and massive construction projects, all clustered in a very narrow window of historical time.
It's like digging in the dirt and finding a fully built Ferrari in a layer of rock where you expected to find a wooden wheelbarrow. I mean, how does UTGH explain this sudden global explosion of complex cities?
By arguing a very simple premise. They didn't invent civilization from scratch, they remembered it.
They remembered it?
Yes. The 8 Ark survivors weren't primitive hominids. They were highly capable, intelligent individuals who carried the accumulated pre-flood knowledge of a world that had existed for over 1.5 millennia. They knew metallurgy. They knew advanced mathematics. They knew astronomical cycles. They knew complex agriculture.
They already had the blueprints in their heads.
Yes. They possessed the inherited memory of a highly sophisticated world. Now, immediately after the flood, there were only 8 of them. You can't build a city with 8 people.
Obviously.
But as soon as their post-flood population grew large enough, over a few centuries, to support the division of labor, they didn't have to spend 2,000 years figuring out the concept of a ziggurat or an aqueduct. They simply rebuilt what they already knew how to build. It was a rapid, explosive re-implementation of a pre-existing societal template, not a slow, fumbling discovery.
Okay, I am totally with you on the logic of inherited memory. It makes complete sense of the sudden appearance of cities. But I have to push back here because if you look at the dates, there is a glaring chronological problem that we absolutely cannot ignore.
Let's hear it.
If the flood happened roughly 5,300 years ago, as the UTGH timeline claims, how does the framework possibly explain a site like Göbekli Tepe?
Ah, yes, Göbekli Tepe.
For those who don't know, Göbekli Tepe is a massive, incredibly complex stone temple complex found in Turkey. It features these enormous T-shaped limestone pillars carved with intricate animals. Mainstream science has radiocarbon dated this site to roughly 11,500 years ago.
Which is deep into the Ice Age, under standard models.
Exactly. That is supposedly thousands of years before agriculture, and crucially for our discussion, it is 6,000 years before UTGH says the flood even happened. How does the model survive that math?
That is the exact right question to ask, and it forces us to look closely at how we actually measure deep time. To understand Göbekli Tepe's date under the UTGH framework, we have to look at what Waters calls the carbon perturbation model.
Carbon perturbation.
Yes, because the 11,500-year date is derived from radiocarbon dating. And radiocarbon dating is brilliant physics, but it relies on a very specific foundational assumption. It assumes that the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the Earth's atmosphere has remained relatively constant over tens of thousands of years.
Okay, let's break that down for a second so everyone is tracking. Carbon-14 is a radioactive isotope created in the upper atmosphere by cosmic rays, right?
Right.
Plants breathe it in, animals eat the plants. So while you are alive, the ratio of carbon-14 to normal carbon-12 in your body matches the atmosphere. When you die, you stop eating, and the carbon-14 slowly decays like a ticking clock. Scientists measure what's left in a bone or a piece of charcoal, compare it to the modern atmospheric baseline, and calculate how long it's been dead. That's the standard method.
Exactly, that's how it works. But UTGH points out that a global cataclysm of the magnitude described in the text would entirely shatter that baseline atmospheric ratio. The rupture event violently altered the Earth's entire carbon inventory.
How so?
First, consider the pre-flood biosphere. We established it was incredibly lush and dense. That means it had locked up massive, unimaginable amounts of carbon in its plant and animal life. During the flood, that entire biosphere was scoured, buried deep underground, and removed from the active carbon cycle.
So it took a ton of carbon out of the system.
Yes, and simultaneously, it pumped a massive amount of different carbon into the system. When the subterranean chambers ruptured the crust, the intense volcanism and tectonic shearing expelled vast quantities of deep geological carbon into the atmosphere and oceans.
Deep geological carbon.
Yes, and deep geological carbon is dead carbon. It has been shielded from cosmic rays underground, so it contains absolutely zero carbon-14. It is pure carbon-12.
Oh, okay, I see where this is going. If you bury all the surface carbon and you vent millions of tons of deep dead carbon into the sky, the ratio is completely thrown out of whack. It dilutes the atmosphere.
It was entirely skewed. The atmosphere immediately following the flood was severely, radically depleted of carbon-14 relative to carbon-12. Now apply that to the people building Göbekli Tepe.
Right?
If they cut down a tree or hunted an animal shortly after the flood, that organism had absorbed carbon from a depleted atmosphere. Its starting baseline of carbon-14 was incredibly low compared to an organism living today.
Meaning, when a scientist digs up a piece of charcoal from Göbekli Tepe and tests it in a lab today, the machine measures the tiny amount of carbon-14, assumes it started with a modern, high baseline, and concludes, wow, this has been decaying for 11,500 years.
When in reality,
It just started with very little carbon-14 to begin with. The clock was artificially wound forward by the atmospheric chemistry of the catastrophe.
exactly. When UTGH applies a calibration curve that corrects for this massive carbon perturbation, accounting for the venting of dead carbon and the slow recovery of the isotope ratio over subsequent centuries, Göbekli Tepe's date shifts drastically forward.
It slides right down the timeline.
It fits perfectly into the immediate post-flood window. Under this model, Göbekli Tepe is not an impossible temple built by primitive hunter-gatherers who magically learned how to carve megaliths. It is exactly what you would expect to find. One of the very first monumental structures built by the immediate descendants of the Ark survivors.
Using their inherited pre-flood architectural knowledge.
Yes, standing as a memorial near the landing site before they dispersed.
That completely reframes the mystery. It's a matter of calibration, not a miracle of caveman engineering. So armed with these pre-flood blueprints, this growing population of survivors begins to spread out from the Ararat region. They were looking to rebuild, but the map they were walking on looked very, very different than the globe we have today.
Radically different. We touched on this earlier, but the immediate consequence of the rupture event was a rapid, severe ice age. And the mechanics of how a flood causes an ice age are crucial to understand.
Yeah, if you're listening to this and wondering how a flood of water causes an ice age, you aren't alone. It sounds totally backward. Usually, we think of ice ages as requiring the whole planet to just slowly get cold.
That is the uniformitarian model, which honestly struggles to explain where the moisture comes from to build massive continental ice sheets if the oceans are also cold. Cold oceans don't evaporate quickly.
Right.
UTGH uses a thermodynamic engine model. The waters that erupted from the subcrustal chambers during the rupture were supercritical, immensely hot, and under extreme pressure. So in the immediate post-flood world, you have global oceans that are exceptionally warm, sitting underneath an atmosphere that is choked with volcanic ash and aerosols blocking the sunlight.
You have hot water and cold air.
Exactly. You essentially had a planetary-scale steam room. The superheated oceans drove massive, sustained, continuous evaporation. That incredible volume of moisture rose up, hit the freezing, dark continental air masses, and fell as snow.
Endless unmelting snow.
Because the summers were blocked by ash, the snow never melted. This rapid, continuous accumulation built the continental ice sheets in a matter of decades or centuries, much, much faster than standard models propose.
And when you pull that much water out of the ocean and lock it up in 2-mile-thick sheets of ice on the land, the bathtub drains.
The ocean levels plummet. UTGH aligns perfectly with standard geological evidence of the glacial maximum here, noting that global sea levels dropped by roughly 120 to 130 meters.
That is over 400 feet. If you drop the oceans 400 feet, you completely redraw the coastlines of the world. Continents that are separated today were suddenly connected by massive tracts of dry land.
It exposed vast, incredibly productive coastal plains that are currently completely underwater. The framework highlights several key areas. Doggerland, for instance, was a massive land bridge connecting Britain to mainland Europe right across what is now the North Sea. The Sunda Shelf was a subcontinent-sized landmass connecting Southeast Asia to the islands of Indonesia. And critically for the cradle of early civilization, the Persian Gulf was entirely dry. It wasn't a sea. It was a lush, fertile river valley fed by the Tigris and Euphrates.
Okay, let's step into the shoes of an Ark descendant. You are looking to build your new civilization. You want fresh water, you want deep, fertile soil for agriculture, and you want a temperate climate because the interior of the continents are freezing under glaciers. Where do you go?
You go low.
Right. You follow the rivers down to these newly exposed coastal plains and river valleys.
Which is exactly the migratory pattern human populations always follow. They settle near the coasts and the river deltas.
This is a huge aha moment for me regarding archaeology. Archaeologists are constantly scratching their heads, wondering why there are so few transitional villages leading up to the big ancient cities we find inland. But it's like looking for a lost civilization in the high mountains when everyone actually built their first homes down on the beach.
That's precisely the issue.
The early Ark descendants settled in these rich, low-lying coastal valleys, and they thrived there. But then, the Ice Age ended.
The oceans eventually cooled, reducing evaporation. The atmospheric debris finally settled out, the sun came back out in full force, and those massive continental ice sheets began to melt. And as millions of cubic miles of ice turned back into liquid, sea levels rose rapidly and relentlessly.
And all those first glorious post-flood settlements
Were swallowed by the sea. The UTGH framework argues that the missing archaeology of early human development, the transitional phases we keep looking for, isn't missing because it never existed. It's missing because it's sitting under 400 feet of ocean water, buried under marine sediment on the continental shelves.
We are literally looking in the wrong places because we don't understand where the shoreline was. And this massive shift in sea level didn't just hide ancient cities, it caused extreme geological chaos. The outline points to a specific event called the Great Salinity Crisis.
This is one of the most remarkable physical events in the Earth's history, and UTGH places it squarely within the human timeline. Because global sea levels dropped so drastically during the peak of the Ice Age, the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow, deep channel connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea became dry land. The sill was exposed, and it closed entirely.
Meaning the Mediterranean basin, which had refilled during the flood, was suddenly cut off from the world's oceans again.
Completely isolated. Now, the Mediterranean basin is subject to intense, punishing evaporation. It loses more water to the sun than its rivers put back in. Over the centuries of the Ice Age, without the Atlantic to replenish it, the Mediterranean Sea completely evaporated.
It just vanished.
It dried up. It became a deep, searingly hot, hostile valley filled with thick, blinding white salt deposits.
I cannot even fathom the scale of that. You're standing on the coast of Italy, and instead of an ocean, you're looking down into a salt canyon 2 miles deep.
It was an alien landscape. But then, as the Ice Age ended and the global sea levels began their rapid rise, the Atlantic waters eventually crept higher and higher up the western side of the Gibraltar Sill. Finally, the water overtopped the dam. This resulted in the Zanclean flood.
Which is not just a trickle.
No, it was a catastrophic, roaring waterfall of ocean water, perhaps 1,000 times larger than Niagara Falls, pouring continuously into the dry Mediterranean basin. It refilled the entire sea in an incredibly short period, violently ripping up the landscape.
Now, mainstream geology totally agrees this happened, right? The salt deposits are down there, the erosion marks are at Gibraltar.
Yes, the physical evidence for the desiccation and the catastrophic refilling is universally accepted. The only difference is the timeline. Mainstream geology places the Zanclean flood over 5 million years ago, long before humans. UTGH, compressing the geological timeline based on the catastrophic mechanics of the Ice Age melt, places this event within human historical memory during the post-flood period.
So early humans might have actually stood on the cliffs of North Africa and watched the Mediterranean refill.
The framework suggests they did.
Yeah.
And biologically, this violent cycle explains a lot about the Mediterranean ecosystem. It explains why marine life in the Mediterranean is so distinct. Any organism trapped there during the crisis had to either epigenetically adapt to extreme, fluctuating salinity as the sea dried up and then violently refilled, or it died out entirely. It acted as an extreme evolutionary filter.
Okay, so the ice is melting, the sea levels are rising globally, filling the Mediterranean, flooding the Persian Gulf, drowning Doggerland. As this happens, something else happens to these human populations that have been spreading out across these temporary land bridges. They get trapped.
Yes. The sprawling, interconnected global human family was suddenly and violently partitioned by the rising waters. The UTGH framework ties this massive geographic event to a specific individual named in the Genesis genealogy, a man named Peleg.
The outline points out that the name Peleg literally translates to division. And according to the chronological data in the text, he was born about 531 years after the flood, which puts it roughly around 2767 BC.
The Genesis text states that in his days the earth was divided. Most traditional commentary interprets this as a linguistic or political division, perhaps related to the Tower of Babel. But UTGH interprets it literally and physically.
The ground itself divided.
Exactly. It wasn't just a political division, it was the physical severing of the Earth's continents. As the ice melted, the post-flood land bridges Doggerland, the Sun to Shelf, the Bering Land Bridge finally submerged for good. Furthermore, UTGH suggests that the tectonic plates, which had been catastrophically fractured and moved during the flood and were still lubricated by residual subcrustal water, made their final violent settling shifts during Peleg's lifetime.
So imagine you are a nomadic tribe. You've just walked from Asia across a grassy plain into what is now Australia, or across the Bering Bridge into the Americas. Suddenly, the climate shifts, the oceans rise rapidly, the ground shakes, and the bridge behind you disappears under 100 feet of water. You are cut off. There's no going back.
You are geographically isolated. Entire populations were sealed off, the Aboriginal Australians on the Sahu landmass, the Andaman Islanders on their remote archipelago, tribes in the deep Americas. They were suddenly completely disconnected from the rest of the Eurasian human family.
And this isolation leads to one of the most important biological shifts in human history.
It acted as an epigenetic pressure cooker. And to understand how profound this is, we have to look at the math of human diversity, a concept the UTGH texts refer to as math time.
Oh, I love math time. Let's do the math.
Let's do it. The standard evolutionary model dictates that producing the sheer, beautiful variety of human physical appearances we see today, different skin tones, bone structures, eye shapes, metabolic adaptations, requires deep time because the standard model relies on slow, random genetic mutations occurring and then slowly propagating through a population over thousands of years of geographic separation.
How much time are we talking about?
To get from a small founder population in Africa to the diversity of an Icelandic fisherman and an Aboriginal Australian, the standard model requires at least 50,000 to 100,000 years. If you assume a generous 30 years per generation, that's roughly 2,300 generations to slowly grind out current human diversity.
But the UTGH timeline says the flood was only 5,300 years ago.
Exactly. UTGH calculates that from the 8 Ark survivors stepping off the boat to the people walking around today is only about 200 generations.
2,300 generations versus 200. I think any skeptical listener is going to stop right here and say, how on earth does UTGH claim we got all this racial and physical diversity in just 200 generations? That seems biologically impossible.
It seems impossible if you are using the uniformitarian model of random mutation. But if we connect this to the bigger picture we discussed earlier, the front-loaded genome, it becomes not just possible, but mathematically expected.
Oh, because it's already there.
Right. UTGH argues that the diversity wasn't built slowly from scratch. The potential for every skin color, every eye shape, every physiological adaptation was already packed into the genomes of Noah's family. The software was fully written, it just hadn't been activated.
We are back to the Swiss Army knife.
Precisely. And what pulls the tools out of the knife? Extreme environmental stress. When these small tribal populations were cut off by the rising sea levels during the Peleg division, they were trapped in radically new, often hostile environments. They faced intense equatorial UV radiation, entirely new diets, novel pathogens, extreme heat, or brutal cold.
It's the ultimate epigenetic trigger.
The extreme stress forced their front-loaded genomes to rapidly express dormant physical traits necessary for survival in that specific isolated location. And because the populations were now cut off from the wider gene pool, Those newly expressed traits were quickly locked in through inbreeding among the isolated group.
It sets quickly.
Within a handful of generations, those survival traits became the dominant permanent phenotype of that localized population.
The UTGH text uses a really wild, intense example to illustrate just how fast this epigenetic expression can happen. The story of Lot's daughters.
Yes, from Genesis 19. It's a dark narrative, but incredibly revealing biologically. After the catastrophic destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his two daughters flee and are isolated in a mountain cave. They believe they are the last people left alive on Earth. Through incest, the two daughters bear sons, and according to the historical record, those sons become the founders of two entirely distinct nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites, who later exhibit distinct cultural and physical characteristics.
So if you take that text literally, as UTGH does, a population of literally 3 people contained enough latent genetic foundation to produce vastly different phenotypic populations in a single generation once they were forced into a new, isolated environment.
That is the core UTGH argument regarding human race. The diversity didn't need 50,000 years of time to evolve. It just needed severe environmental stress to be expressed. All modern human diversity is the result of a rapid, desperate epigenetic explosion triggered by a broken, partitioned world.
And as these populations were cut off, as they changed physically to match their new environments, developing darker skin near the equator, different metabolic rates in the Arctic, they took something else with them into isolation, something cultural that survived the geographic split.
The memory of the end of the world.
The flood traditions, I've always been fascinated by this. The outline notes that over 270 distinct cultures globally have a flood myth. And we aren't just talking about a vague story about a river overflowing its banks and ruining a harvest.
No, the architectural consistency across these global myths is staggering. Whether you are looking at Utnapishtim in the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, the legends of Emperor Yu in early Chinese records, or the story of Nu Yu in native Hawaiian tradition, they almost all share identical core narrative elements.
There's a divine or supernatural warning of impending doom. A massive vessel is built specifically for preservation, a small select group of survivors is saved along with a representation of animals, and they land on a mountain or high ground to repopulate a ruined Earth. It's the same blueprint everywhere.
Mainstream anthropology generally attempts to explain this through a concept called cultural diffusion. The idea is that someone in Mesopotamia, where localized river floods were common, told a really compelling, exaggerated campfire story about a flood. Because it was a good story, it slowly traded hands along the Silk Road, spreading from merchant to merchant, from culture to culture, slowly migrating across the globe over thousands of years.
And if you're listening, you might think, well, couldn't that be true? People love a good apocalypse movie today. Maybe it just went viral in the ancient world.
It sounds plausible until you look at the geography. And the UTGH framework absolutely dismantles the cultural diffusion argument, using the very isolation we just talked about. Think about the populations that were cut off by the rising sea levels during the Peleg division.
The Aboriginal Australians and the Andaman Islanders, the tribes deep in the Amazon basin.
Exactly. These are some of the most isolated peoples on the planet. The Aboriginal Australians have been separated from the Eurasian landmass since the Sahul Shelf submerged. The Amazonian tribes were locked deep in impenetrable rainforests. The Pacific Islanders were separated by thousands of miles of open ocean.
They weren't exactly setting up trade outposts on the Silk Road to chat with Mesopotamian merchants.
They had zero contact with the Middle East. If the flood story simply diffused from Babylon via trade, there should be other markers of that contact. But there aren't. There are no Mesopotamian trade goods in ancient Australian archaeological sites. There are no Sumerian linguistic loanwords in deep Amazonian languages. There is no shared cosmological framework, no shared gods, no shared agricultural techniques. The only complex cultural artifact they share is this one incredibly specific story of a global deluge.
So if they didn't trade for the story and they didn't hear it from a traveling merchant, how did they get it?
UTGH argues the only mathematically and logically sound explanation for this incredible convergence is that they are all independently remembering the exact same physical event. They didn't borrow the story. Their ancestors lived it.
Wow.
The 8 people who stepped off the ark passed the traumatic memory to their children. As those descendants dispersed across the land bridges, they carried the memory of the catastrophe with them. When the oceans rose and cut them off, they preserved it in their oral traditions in total isolation for millennia.
It's not a myth. It's the shared, inherited trauma of the entire human race. It's a scar we all carry. And speaking of shared history, as these Ark descendants dispersed across Eurasia, pushing into new territories, some of them eventually walked back up into those rugged mountain corridors, the Zagros, the Caucasus, the Altai Mountains, and we know who was waiting for them up there in the caves.
The Highland survivors, Kane's line, the people mainstream science calls Neanderthals and Denisovans, who had been riding out the freezing post-flood centuries in their newly formed limestone caves, getting more and more morphologically distinct.
So picture this collision. The lowland Ark descendants who are spreading out and building cities push up into the hills and meet the highland cave dwellers. What happens? Do they wipe them out?
Not entirely. What happens is reintegration, a
Oh.
massive, chaotic family reunion. And this is where UTGH beautifully addresses the modern genetic evidence of admixture. In the last decade, genomic sequencing has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that most people of European and Asian descent carry approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA.
Which mainstream science usually presents as our modern ancestors migrating out of Africa and occasionally interbreeding with a lesser, separate primitive species before driving them to extinction.
But under the UTGH framework, it is not interspecies breeding at all. It is the genetic signature of two branches of the exact same human family tree, separated before the flood by geography, subjected to different environmental stressors, and now reuniting and reintegrating after the post-flood world stabilized and migration routes opened up.
And the geography of this reunion lines up perfectly with the physical evidence.
It does. The UTGH text highlights a truly striking piece of evidence from Denisova Cave, located in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Researchers sequenced a bone fragment from a young female found in that cave. The genetic results were astonishing. She had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father.
A literal first-generation hybrid of the two groups.
Yes. And look at the map. Under the UTGH corridor model, Denisova Cave is located at the exact geographic convergence point, where the Western Highland Corridor, which was home to the Neanderthal morphology, meets the Eastern Highland Corridor, which was home to the Denisovan morphology.
It's right in the middle.
It is exactly the spot where you would mathematically predict these two distinct populations of pre-flood Highlanders would encounter each other as the harsh Ice Age conditions slightly relented and they began to move along the mountain ridges.
It's like finding a needle in a massive haystack, exactly where the UTGH map said the needle would be.
It confirms the profound predictive power of the geographic model. The genetic record we find in the dirt isn't showing a neat, linear evolutionary tree slowly branching off over millions of years. It's showing a record of extreme environmental disruption, rapid epigenetic divergence due to isolation, and then chaotic partial reintegration as geographic corridors opened and closed.
Okay, we have covered an unbelievable amount of ground today. The scope of this UTGH narrative is just breathtaking when you really step back and look at it. We started in the lush, sunken lowlands of Eden, exploring how it was destroyed, buried, and cooked into the oil fields of the Arabian Peninsula. We tracked the two lineages, the Sethites and the Perfect Valleys and the Canaanites building advanced, musical cultures in the hard, rocky highlands.
We saw how the catastrophic rupture event inundated the lowlands, leaving the Highlanders to survive purely by altitude. We explored how the chemically supersaturated floodwaters precipitated soft limestone, providing a canvas for those Highlanders to carve caves to escape the sudden, violent post-flood ice age, eventually compounding into the robust Neanderthals of the archaeological record.
We followed Noah's family, the ultimate genetic bottleneck, stepping off the ark with pristine, front-loaded genomes that rapidly degraded. We tracked that terrifying dose-response longevity curve as the loss of the pre-flood atmosphere and intense UV radiation battered their DNA. We explored how they rebuilt massive cities from inherited pre-flood memory, completely solving the Uruk problem and realigning sites like Göbekli Tepe using the carbon perturbation model.
And we traced their descendants as they migrated across exposed Ice Age land bridges, eventually getting trapped by the rapidly melting ice and rising seas during the days of Peleg. We saw how that geographic isolation triggered a rapid epigenetic explosion, producing the incredible diversity of the human family in just 200 generations, all while carrying the traumatic memory of the flood to every isolated corner of the globe before finally bumping back into their highland cousins in the mountains.
It is a profound, incredibly cohesive alternate vision of who we are and how we got here. It connects the dots of archaeology, geology, and genetics in a way that is hard to ignore, even if you approach it with intense skepticism.
It leaves us with a critical, unsettling question about the ground beneath our feet and the history written in ourselves. If the unified theory of geologic history is correct, We are not a species slowly, triumphantly grinding our way up from primitive ape-like beginnings over millions of years of random chance.
No, we are something much more poignant. We are a profoundly resilient family of amnesiacs living on the wrecked and rebuilt ruins of a lost
That
masterpiece.
is the absolute essence of the framework. We are survivors making do in a fractured world.
So, to you, the listener, we leave you with this final provocative thought. The next time you look at a rugged mountain range, or step into a damp limestone cave, or pump gas into your car, or even just look around at a wonderfully diverse crowd of people, ask yourself, are you looking at millions of years of slow, random, unguided drift? Or are you looking at the rapid, desperate, and magnificent echoes of the day the world broke and was mercifully given back to us?